Have you ever felt a heaviness that no one else can see? A weight pressing down on your chest, making every breath feel just a little harder. It isn't a bag on your shoulders, and it isn't something you can point at. Yet somehow, it shapes the way you move, the way you think, the way you live. This is the invisible weight we all carry. It comes in many forms. There's the weight of expectation, from parents, from society, from the versions of ourselves we feel we must live up to. There's the weight of regret, of mistakes we replay endlessly, like old films running in the back of our minds. There's the weight of fear. Fear of failure, fear of loss, fear of being seen as small or unworthy. And intertwined with all of these is the subtle, almost invisible weight of attachment. The things we cling to, whether they are people, objects, memories, or even ideas of who we think we are. In the quiet corners of our minds, this weight accumulates, layer upon layer. We often don't notice it until one day, under the glare of some crisis or disappointment, it becomes almost unbearable. It is a shadow that follows us everywhere, invisible to others but impossible to ignore. What if I told you that wisdom isn't about carrying this weight more efficiently? That true strength isn't about clinging tighter to what we think defines us. In fact, the opposite is true. There is a profound freedom in knowing when to let go, in recognizing that some things are not ours to hold, and in understanding that the very act of holding on can sometimes be what chains us the most. Throughout history, the greatest teachers, sages, and enlightened beings have observed this. They saw that suffering often comes not from what life gives, but from what we refuse to release. And yet, letting go is not simple. It is not a single moment of decision. It is a practice, a subtle, ongoing art of discernment. It requires courage, mindfulness, and sometimes the quiet patience to watch ourselves struggle with the very things we are learning to release. Imagine for a moment a person holding a heavy stone. At first, it feels solid, familiar, maybe even necessary. But over time, their arms ache, their back strains, and their steps falter. And yet they hesitate to set it down. Why? Because it has become part of their identity. They believe they are stronger, more capable, or more complete by holding it. But in reality, the stone was never theirs to carry. And the moment they finally release it, even just slightly, they discover a lightness they had long forgotten. A freedom that doesn't come from gaining, but from letting go. This is not a metaphor for weakness. On the contrary, it is an act of strength. It is the courage to face what binds us, to recognize the futility of certain attachments, and to open our hands to life exactly as it is, without grasping, without clinging, without forcing. As we embark on this journey together, we will explore the subtle but transformative power of letting go. We will look at why we cling to things that cause us suffering, how to recognize what is truly ours and what is not, and the deep inner freedom that comes from releasing what no longer serves us. Along the way, you'll hear stories of ordinary people and enlightened masters alike, people who learned, sometimes painfully, that the wisest path is often the one that involves surrender rather than control. By the end of this journey, you will begin to see the invisible weights in your own life, and more importantly, you will start to understand the quiet power in putting them down, because letting go is not giving up. It is stepping into a space where clarity, peace, and genuine strength can finally flourish. And in that space, you may discover something remarkable, that the very things we thought defined us were, in fact, the things that held us back. We carry many things in our hearts, some light, some heavy, but few as persistent as attachment. It is subtle, almost invisible, yet its influence runs deep. Attachment is more than desire. It is the mind's insistence that something outside of ourselves can complete us, protect us, or define who we are. It whispers that happiness is always just beyond reach, locked inside the arms of a person, a possession, or an idea. Think for a moment about the things you cling to most. Perhaps it is a relationship that has become strained, yet you fear letting go, imagining your life would crumble without it. Maybe it is a career or an achievement, a title or a recognition, something you believe will finally make you enough. Or perhaps it is a memory, a regret, a what if that you replay endlessly, unable to release. Attachment is a paradox. We pursue what we think will bring us happiness, yet in clinging to it, we often create the very suffering we hope to avoid. The object of our desire becomes a source of anxiety, fear, or disappointment the moment it slips from our control. And yet, letting go seems impossible. Why? Because attachment is not just about what we hold outside ourselves. It is about how we define ourselves inside. The Buddha taught that all suffering arises from clinging. In the original teachings, the word tanha, often translated as craving or thirst, refers not just to desire but to a deep, compulsive grasping, a need to make transient things permanent. When we hold tightly to the impermanent, we set ourselves up for pain. Every change, every loss, every moment we cannot control becomes a reminder of what we refuse to release. But attachment is not always dramatic. It can be quiet and ordinary, woven into the everyday fabric of life. The attachment to comfort keeps us from embracing challenge. The attachment to certainty keeps us from exploring new possibilities. The attachment to our own story keeps us trapped in the roles we've assigned ourselves: parent, friend, partner, worker, thinker, long after these roles have become burdensome or outdated. And yet, the mind clings instinctively. This is where understanding the nature of attachment becomes so crucial. It is not about guilt or judgment, it is about awareness. By recognizing our attachments, we can see the subtle chains that bind us, the invisible weights that shape our choices and limit our freedom. Awareness is the first step. Curiosity and honesty come next, and only then can we begin the art of letting go. Consider the metaphor of a river. Attachment is like holding onto a branch drifting downstream. At first, it seems solid, something to grasp, something to guide us. But the branch is carried by the current, and the harder we cling, the more it scratches our hands. The wise do not resist the river. They learn to release the branch, to float with the flow, to understand that the water moves whether we fight it or not. In everyday life, attachment can take countless forms. We cling to relationships out of fear of loneliness. We cling to achievements out of fear of insignificance. We cling to our opinions out of fear of being wrong or unknown. We cling to memories, even painful ones, because they define the narrative of who we are. The process of recognizing attachment is like turning on a light in a dark room. Suddenly, the invisible weight becomes visible. We see the patterns of thought and behavior that keep us tethered to what no longer serves us. And with awareness comes choice. Once we notice what we cling to, we can ask ourselves, is this serving my well-being? Does this bring freedom, or does it bind me further? Attachment is deeply human. We all experience it, and it is not something to be ashamed of. The question is not whether we have attachments. It is whether we are willing to see them clearly and examine them with courage and compassion. Because the truth is simple, yet profound. We suffer when we hold on too tightly, when we believe we can possess the impermanent. And the wisest among us are those who learn to release, not through force, but through understanding, through insight, and through the steady cultivation of awareness. As we continue, we will explore how to distinguish between what is truly ours and what is only a shadow, how to recognize the subtle chains of attachment in our lives, and how the simple yet powerful act of letting go opens the door to clarity and freedom. In the previous moments, we explored how attachment can quietly bind us, shaping our choices and coloring our perception of life. Now comes a question that strikes at the very heart of freedom. What is truly yours? We are taught from a young age to pursue, to acquire, to hold. Ownership feels natural, ownership of objects, of roles, even of relationships. But the Buddha's wisdom asks a deeper question. What can we claim as ours without inviting suffering? What can we hold without fear, without the ache of loss? Most of what we cling to is not ours at all. Consider your possessions. You may call them mine, but they are impermanent. They age, they break, they slip from your hands unexpectedly. Relationships, too, are not possessions. The people we love have their own paths, their own choices, and no matter how tightly we grasp, their freedom is not ours to control. Even our thoughts and emotions. those intimate companions of our mind, cannot be permanently possessed. They come and go like clouds drifting across a wide, open sky. Recognizing what is truly yours is the first step toward inner liberation. It is not about renouncing life or detaching from joy. Rather, it is about seeing clearly, understanding deeply, and embracing reality as it is. True ownership resides not in the objects we collect, but in the awareness, the insight, and the presence we cultivate within ourselves. Imagine standing in a vast garden. Around you bloom countless flowers, each with its own beauty, its own scent. You may admire them, even care for them, but you do not own them. To try to seize them, to clutch at their petals, would only crush what you most appreciate. Yet, as you walk slowly, noticing the sunlight and the breeze, you realize something. The garden itself, the experience of being fully present, is yours. It cannot be taken away, it does not fade with time, and it requires nothing from anyone but your attention and awareness. This principle extends to every aspect of life. Your peace of mind, your clarity of thought, your compassion, and your love, these are truly yours. They are not contingent on circumstances, titles, or material wealth. They exist in the quiet space between thought and action, in the moments when you notice without clinging, when you engage without grasping, when you love without owning. But recognizing this truth is not always easy. The mind rebels against letting go, especially when it feels that losing something means losing a part of yourself. Here lies the subtle genius of Buddhist practice. It teaches us to observe without judgment, to see the impermanence of all things, and to cultivate a sense of inner belonging that is independent of the external world. One practice that illuminates this path is mindful reflection. Take a moment to examine the things you feel you cannot live without. Ask yourself, does this bring me freedom or fear? Does this empower me or chain me? By observing with honesty, you begin to distinguish between what nourishes your spirit and what entangles it. Stories from the lives of enlightened beings remind us of this truth. Monks and sages have often relinquished possessions, titles, even families, not out of disdain but out of clarity. They recognized that the world offers experiences, not ownership, and that peace resides not in accumulation but in discernment. They discovered that the heart can hold love, joy, and compassion while hands remain open. And here lies a subtle paradox. The more we release, the more we possess. When we let go of what is fleeting, we create space for what is enduring. When we stop trying to control outcomes, we become fully present to the richness of each moment. When we stop grasping for approval or validation, we awaken to our own inherent worth. Recognizing what is truly yours is not a one-time revelation. It is a lifelong practice, a gentle inquiry into the essence of your experience. It invites patience, curiosity, and courage. And as we continue, we will explore how this awareness prepares us for the most challenging and liberating act of all, knowing when to let go. Because knowing what is truly yours is the foundation. Without it, any attempt to release will be clouded by fear, doubt, and confusion. With it, each act of letting go becomes a step into freedom, a choice that aligns with wisdom rather than compulsion. Recognizing what is truly yours is an essential step, but wisdom lies not only in seeing clearly, it also lies in knowing when to act. Timing is everything. To hold on too long can bind us, yet to release too soon can leave us unsteady, unprepared, or incomplete. The art of letting go is not a single, decisive moment. It is a delicate dance between awareness and courage. Imagine a tree in autumn. Its leaves hang on stubbornly, clinging to branches even as the cold wind whispers for release. Those that resist fall late, sometimes torn and tattered. Those that release at the right moment drift gracefully to the ground, nourished for the next cycle. Life is much like this. There is a rhythm to attachment, a natural unfolding that cannot be rushed or forced. We cling to what feels essential because we fear loss. We fear emptiness, fear change, fear the unknown. And yet, holding on to what no longer serves us, even if it once did, creates tension, frustration, and suffering. The wise, however, cultivate discernment. They notice when the weight is unnecessary, when the branch has become a burden, when the path ahead requires letting go. But how do we know? How can we sense the right moment to release? Here are 3 guiding principles. 1. Observe the signs of strain. Life often gives us subtle signals that something must change. Relationships that drain rather than nourish. Projects that no longer align with our values. Emotions that replay endlessly, offering nothing but unrest. When tension becomes constant, when joy diminishes, when the effort outweighs the reward, it may be time to loosen our grip. 2. Cultivate inner clarity. We cannot make wise choices while clouded by fear or desire. Meditation and mindfulness help us see clearly. They reveal whether attachment is rooted in love, responsibility, or fear. They allow us to step back and ask, is this holding me together or is it holding me back? With clarity, we act from insight rather than impulse. 3. Practice gradual release. Letting go rarely happens all at once. It is a gradual process, a series of small, intentional steps. Sometimes it begins with shifting perspective, seeing a situation differently, reframing a relationship, adjusting expectations. Sometimes it requires action, speaking a truth, setting a boundary, stepping away. And sometimes it simply requires patience, waiting until the timing is right, until our hearts are ready to release without regret or resistance. Stories from life, both ordinary and extraordinary, illustrate this principle. Consider a teacher who knows a student must learn independently. Holding on too tightly would stifle growth, but releasing too soon would leave the student unprepared. The teacher waits, guides, and observes, releasing when the student is ready to stand. The same applies to our own lives. Timing, wisdom, and patience guide the act of letting go. There is also a profound spiritual dimension to this timing. The Buddha often emphasized the principle of right action, part of the Noble Eightfold Path. Right action is not impulsive. It is in harmony with understanding and compassion. To let go at the right moment is a form of right action. It requires seeing beyond immediate desire, beyond ego, and into the unfolding flow of life. And yet, wisdom in timing is not about control. It is not about trying to manipulate circumstances to fit our comfort. It is about awareness, patience, and trust. Trust that life unfolds in cycles, that letting go when the time is right is always aligned with our deeper well-being. The wise understand that the moment may not always feel perfect, but action rooted in clarity and discernment carries its own grace. Even our emotions can guide us. Notice the difference between anxiety that urges you to cling and calm intuition that suggests release. Anxiety is often fear-driven. Intuition arises from insight. The challenge is to cultivate inner stillness, so the voice of wisdom can be heard above the clamor of habit, fear, and desire. Knowing when to let go also requires courage. Fear tells us to wait forever, to hold on, to maintain the illusion of control. Courage tells us to trust, to release, and to step into uncertainty with a steady heart. And paradoxically, this courage does not weaken us, it strengthens us. Each act of letting go, performed with discernment and compassion, builds resilience, clarity, and freedom. Ultimately, the wisdom of timing is about alignment with ourselves, with life, and with the impermanent nature of all things. It is an art, a practice, a lifelong study. When we release at the right moment, we move not into emptiness, but into spaciousness, a freedom that allows new growth, new opportunities, and new understanding. As we continue, we will explore how letting go does not mean losing ourselves. In fact, it is through the act of release that we often discover the deepest aspects of who we are. Strength, clarity, and presence that no attachment could ever provide. So far, we've explored the invisible weights we carry, the nature of attachment, the recognition of what is truly ours, and the wisdom of timing. Now, we arrive at a subtle but essential question. How can we let go without losing ourselves in the process? Releasing attachments can feel threatening. The very act of letting go may stir a fear that we are abandoning who we are, our identity, or our sense of security. Yet paradoxically, the opposite is true. It is through careful, mindful release that we often discover the truest, most resilient version of ourselves. Letting go does not mean detachment in the sense of apathy. It does not mean shutting down our emotions, avoiding love, or fleeing responsibility. It means engaging with life fully, while freeing ourselves from the illusions that cause suffering. It means holding the heart open, without clenching tightly to outcomes, identities, or possessions. Consider the metaphor of a bird in a hand. Clutch too tightly and the bird suffers and may even die. Release too abruptly without care and the bird may fly away unprepared, vulnerable. But hold gently with awareness and let it soar when the time is right. And in that process, you understand the balance of care, love, and freedom. In practical terms, letting go without losing yourself involves 3 essential practices. 1. Cultivating inner anchors. Your sense of self is not found in what you hold, but in your awareness and presence. Practices like meditation, reflection, and mindful breathing create an inner stability that remains intact, even as external circumstances shift. When your center is grounded in clarity and understanding, release becomes an act of empowerment rather than a surrender to fear. 2. Engaging with intentionality. Release is not the same as avoidance. Letting go thoughtfully means choosing where to invest your energy, attention, and care. It means acting with purpose, deciding what nourishes your growth, what brings genuine joy, and what aligns with your values. By letting go intentionally, you maintain integrity, clarity, and a strong sense of self. 3. Embracing compassion for yourself. Fear of loss often hides beneath attachment. To release without losing yourself, you must cultivate self-compassion. Recognize your vulnerability, your fears, and your limitations without judgment. Treat yourself as you would a dear friend, gentle, patient, and understanding. Compassion allows the heart to remain open, even as it releases what no longer serves it. Stories from the lives of enlightened beings remind us of this delicate balance. Consider monks who renounced wealth and status but did not renounce their humanity. They let go of worldly attachments yet embraced the fullness of their being, curiosity, compassion, and a deep connection to life. They demonstrate that true release strengthens the self rather than diminishes it. Everyday life offers similar lessons. Imagine ending a relationship that no longer nurtures you. At first, there may be grief, doubt, or guilt. But if you approach the process with awareness, compassion, and clarity, you find that the ending is not a loss of self. Instead, it becomes a reclamation of your energy, attention, and dignity. Letting go does not erase your story. It allows you to continue writing it with greater freedom and authenticity. It is important to remember that letting go is a gradual, iterative process. We may stumble, cling too long, or release prematurely. What matters is persistence, reflection, and gentle course correction. Each act of release teaches us more about ourselves, deepens our understanding, and cultivates resilience. Letting go without losing yourself is also a form of empowerment. You realize that your sense of worth does not depend on external validation. Your peace does not hinge on outcomes or possessions. Your identity is not confined to roles or labels. The freedom you cultivate through mindful release allows you to engage with life fully, with presence, creativity, and a heart that is open rather than contracted. Ultimately, this practice invites us into a paradox. The more we release, the more we discover. The less we cling, the deeper our understanding of who we truly are. And the more we embrace the art of letting go with mindfulness, compassion, and clarity, the more our lives become a reflection of wisdom in action. As we move forward, we will explore practical tools, like meditation and mindfulness, that help us release the invisible weights we carry, without ever losing sight of ourselves. We will see how intentional practice transforms release from a fearful act into a joyful and liberating experience. Letting go is not just a decision of the mind. It is a practice of the heart, cultivated through awareness, patience, and presence. And there is no more powerful way to develop this inner freedom than through meditation and mindfulness. These are the tools that help us untangle the knots of attachment, observe our thoughts and emotions without judgment, and release what no longer serves us. Imagine your mind as a busy marketplace, full of chatter, noise, and endless activity. Thoughts clamor for attention, memories tug at your emotions, and desires pull you in countless directions. In this chaos, letting go can feel impossible. Meditation is the pause, the quiet space that allows you to step back from the commotion. Mindfulness is the lens, bringing clarity to the patterns that keep you bound. Together, they create a sanctuary of awareness within the mind. There are many forms of meditation, but at the core of each is a simple invitation. Observe without grasping, notice without clinging. When a thought arises, whether it is fear, regret, or longing, simply notice it. Name it if you like. This is fear, this is desire, this is sadness. By labeling it, you create distance. You are no longer entangled. You are the observer, the witness. Mindfulness extends this awareness into everyday life. It asks you to notice the sensations, emotions, and impulses that arise in each moment. When a situation triggers attachment or clinging, mindfulness allows you to pause and ask, do I need to hold on? Am I grasping unnecessarily? Over time, this practice strengthens the ability to release naturally, without force, without struggle. Consider the example of a painful memory. In the past, you may have tried to suppress it, distract yourself from it, or replay it endlessly. Mindfulness teaches you to bring the memory gently into awareness, to feel it fully, and then to let it pass like a cloud drifting across the sky. You do not resist it, you do not chase it, and you do not allow it to define your present. In this simple act, freedom begins to emerge. Breath awareness is a particularly powerful tool. The breath is constant, impartial, and always with you. By anchoring your attention to your breathing, you create a stable point amidst mental turbulence. As you inhale, you can acknowledge what arises. As you exhale, you can release it. Inhale awareness, exhale attachment. Inhale presence, exhale tension. The rhythm itself becomes a meditation on letting go. Visualization is another technique. Picture yourself holding a stone that represents a fear, a regret, or an attachment. Feel its weight, acknowledge its presence, and then imagine placing it down. Watch as it rolls away, leaving your hands, your mind, and your heart lighter. This simple act of imagination translates into real shifts in perception and experience over time. Journaling can complement meditation and mindfulness. Writing down thoughts and emotions brings them into form, externalizing what was previously internal and tangled. When you see your attachments written on paper, they often lose some of their grip. Reflection allows insight, which attachments serve growth and which hold you back. The practice is not about perfection. Thoughts will arise. Attachments will tug. The mind will resist. This is natural. Meditation and mindfulness are not about suppressing or controlling experience. They are about developing skillful attention. Over time, you learn to respond rather than react, to release without struggle, and to hold space for clarity and peace. Stories from monastic life illustrate this beautifully. Monks and nuns spend hours in meditation each day, observing the arising and passing of thoughts, emotions, and sensations. They practice letting go moment by moment, refining their awareness until release becomes almost effortless. Yet this mastery is not magic. It is cultivated through patience, consistency, and deep curiosity about the mind. Even in everyday life, we can bring this practice into action. Waiting in line, walking to work, washing dishes, any moment can become an opportunity for mindful release. Notice the urge to cling to frustration, judgment, or worry, and consciously allow it to pass. Each small act compounds, building the inner strength and freedom that carry over into bigger challenges. The most profound lesson of meditation and mindfulness is this: letting go is not a single heroic act. It is a continuous, gentle unfolding. It is a skill we practice in quiet moments, a thread we weave through each day, gradually transforming our relationship to attachment, fear, and desire. And in doing so, we discover that release is not emptiness. It is fullness, a spaciousness where peace, clarity, and joy naturally reside. As we move forward, we will see how letting go extends beyond the mind to the heart, especially through the cultivation of compassion and forgiveness. For sometimes, the heaviest attachments are not to things or people, but to anger, resentment, or regret. Understanding how to release these is the next step on the path to true freedom. By now, we have explored the invisible weights we carry, the nature of attachment, the recognition of what is truly ours, the wisdom of timing, and the tools of meditation and mindfulness. Yet one of the deepest obstacles to letting go lies not in things or people, but within our hearts: resentment, anger, and unforgiven pain. Holding onto anger or grudges is like gripping a burning coal. We believe it will harm the other person, but in reality, it scorches our own hands. It consumes energy, clouds our judgment, and keeps us chained to past hurts. Forgiveness is the act of setting down that coal, not because the other deserves it, but because we deserve freedom. Compassion and forgiveness are two sides of the same coin. Compassion begins with seeing clearly that all beings are caught in their own suffering, just as we are. When we recognize that pain drives harmful actions, we soften the rigid boundaries of judgment. Forgiveness is the expression of that compassion, allowing us to release resentment while maintaining awareness and integrity. Consider a personal betrayal. At first, the wound feels fresh, raw, impossible to forget. Our instinct is to hold on, to replay the memory, to cling to anger as though it were a shield. But as mindfulness deepens, we begin to observe the emotion rather than be consumed by it. We see that anger does not punish the offender, it punishes us. Forgiveness then becomes not a favor to them, but a gift to ourselves. Compassion extends this practice beyond ourselves. It encourages us to recognize that those who hurt us are also struggling with their own fears, ignorance, and attachments. Their actions may be harmful, but they are a reflection of their suffering, not the essence of their being. By seeing this, we soften the impulse to cling to resentment and create space for release. Stories from Buddhist teachings offer profound illustrations. There are countless accounts of individuals who faced deep betrayal, cruelty, or injustice, yet found liberation through forgiveness. One notable example is the story of Angulimala, a notorious bandit who caused great harm. Through the compassionate guidance of the Buddha, he renounced violence and transformed his life. Here, we see that even the heaviest attachments to anger and harm can be released, not through force, but through awareness, compassion, and the courage to let go. In practical terms, cultivating compassion and forgiveness begins with small, deliberate steps. Acknowledgement: recognize the pain honestly without denial or repression. Observation: notice the emotions that arise when recalling the situation. Are you clinging to anger or resentment? Empathy: try to understand the perspective of the other person, recognizing their humanity and suffering. Release: consciously choose to let go of the need to punish, to control, or to dwell. This does not mean that forgiveness erases justice or absolves wrongdoing. It simply frees the mind and heart from the corrosive effects of holding on. It transforms release into a conscious, empowering act rather than a passive resignation. Compassion and forgiveness are also practices toward ourselves. Many of us carry shame, guilt, or regret, gripping them tightly as though they define our worth. Here too, release requires awareness, acceptance, and the willingness to treat ourselves with the same kindness we offer to others. By letting go of self-condemnation, we create the inner space necessary for peace and clarity. The practice is not linear. Emotions may resurface, memories may sting, and the impulse to cling may return. But each time we pause, observe, and choose compassion over resentment, forgiveness over bitterness, the weight lightens. It is a gradual process, one that unfolds moment by moment, choice by choice. As we cultivate these qualities, we discover a remarkable truth. The heart that can forgive is the heart that is free. Anger and resentment dissolve, not through suppression, but through understanding and release. Compassion becomes a source of resilience, allowing us to navigate life's inevitable challenges with grace, clarity, and strength. And as we continue on this path, we will see how these principles extend into everyday life, not just in grand or dramatic moments, but in the ordinary, quiet spaces where attachment, desire, and fear arise. Recognizing and practicing release in these moments prepares us to embrace life with openness, awareness, and the quiet freedom that comes from a heart unburdened by anger or resentment. From here, we will explore concrete, everyday stories of letting go, the simple, often unnoticed acts of release that transform lives in subtle but profound ways. These stories remind us that the practice of letting go is not abstract or distant. It is alive in each decision, each interaction, each breath. Letting go is often spoken of as a grand spiritual act, but in truth, it is woven into the quiet rhythms of everyday life. It happens not only in moments of dramatic loss or great upheaval, but in ordinary decisions, fleeting thoughts, and small acts of awareness. These everyday moments are where the practice of release truly takes root. Consider the story of Anna, a woman weighed down by resentment toward a former colleague. Every morning, she would rehearse past grievances, letting the irritation linger as she sipped her coffee. One day she noticed the pattern. This repetition was stealing her energy, her focus, and her joy. With mindful awareness, she began to practice letting go, not by excusing the behavior, but by refusing to carry it as a burden anymore. She still remembered, she still learned, but she released the emotional chains. Over time, she discovered a surprising lightness, a freedom she hadn't felt in years. Then there is Marcus, a man clinging to the idea of perfection in his work. Every project had to meet his impossibly high standards, and every perceived failure became a source of shame. Through mindfulness, he recognized the futility of this attachment. Gradually, he allowed himself to do his best without needing everything to be flawless. In letting go of rigid control, he found creativity, satisfaction, and a new ease in his work. Even in the smallest interactions, letting go shapes our experience. Imagine waiting in a long line at a grocery store, irritation rising with each passing minute. In that moment, you can choose to cling to frustration, or you can take a breath, notice the tension, and release it. The line becomes just a line, not a battlefield. This small act of letting go doesn't seem like much, yet it transforms your inner world and ripples outward to influence your mood, your interactions, and your day. Stories from the natural world also offer insight. Think of a tree shedding leaves in autumn. The leaves do not resist. They let go naturally in perfect timing with the seasons. In doing so, the tree prepares for growth, renewal, and balance. Humans, too, are subject to seasons, moments when holding on nourishes, and moments when release allows new life to emerge. The wisdom lies in noticing the cycles and participating consciously. Sometimes, letting go involves relationships. Consider a friendship that has grown strained over time. Conversations become tense, expectations unmet, and both sides cling to old patterns. To release this attachment doesn't mean abandoning care. It means recognizing that the connection has shifted, that holding on causes more pain than growth. By letting go, both individuals are freed to cultivate healthier bonds while still honoring the memories and experiences shared. Letting go can also apply to internal struggles, self-judgment, fear, and doubt. Rachel, a young artist, was paralyzed by the fear of rejection. Each time she picked up a brush, anxiety clenched her hand. Through mindfulness and self-compassion, she began to release the grip of fear, accepting imperfection and embracing the process of creation. In the act of letting go, she discovered joy, freedom, and an authentic connection to her art. Even financial and material attachments offer lessons. John clung to money, status, and possessions as sources of security. Yet every unexpected bill, every loss, and every failure reminded him that control is always limited. Over time, he practiced releasing anxiety over external circumstances, focusing instead on gratitude, generosity, and purpose. In this way, he experienced the profound security that comes from inner freedom rather than accumulation. The common thread in all these stories is subtle yet powerful. Letting go is not an abandonment of life. It is an engagement with life, fully present without grasping, resisting, or demanding. Each act of release creates space for clarity, space for growth, space for joy. When we let go of what we cannot control, we gain what truly matters: our peace, our presence, and our freedom. In our daily lives, moments of release accumulate into transformation. It may be letting go of irritation in traffic, disappointment in work, resentment in relationships, or fear in our hearts. Each choice to release builds resilience, cultivates wisdom, and opens the door to experiences unclouded by attachment. These stories remind us that letting go is not a distant spiritual ideal. It is a practical, living practice. It can be woven into every breath, every action, every thought. And the more we practice in ordinary moments, the more prepared we are to release in extraordinary ones when the stakes feel high and the attachment feels heavy. As we continue, we will explore the long-term rewards of letting go, the clarity, freedom, and inner peace that emerge when we make space in our hearts and minds. The lessons of everyday practice culminate in profound transformation, a journey from burden to liberation. If Chapter 8 showed us the subtle, transformative power of letting go in everyday moments, then Chapter 9 invites us to see the full measure of its long-term rewards. Because when release becomes a practice rather than a rare act, life changes in profound, undeniable ways. The invisible weight we once carried begins to lift, revealing clarity, freedom, and a peace that is both steady and resilient. The first reward is freedom, not the fleeting kind that comes from circumstances changing, but the deep, lasting freedom that arises from within. When we release attachment to outcomes, people, possessions, and even our own identities, we no longer live at the mercy of external forces. Our inner space becomes expansive. Decisions are made with clarity rather than fear. We move through life lightly, no longer weighed down by burdens that were never truly ours to carry. Consider a man named Daniel. For years, he measured his worth by approval, success, and recognition. Every setback felt catastrophic, every criticism a wound. Slowly, through meditation, mindfulness, and the courage to release attachment to results, Daniel discovered a new sense of freedom. He still worked hard, still loved deeply, but no longer allowed circumstances to dictate his peace. His life became lighter, richer, and infinitely more sustainable. The second reward is clarity. Letting go clears the mental fog that attachment and clinging create. When our minds are no longer occupied with grasping or defending, we can see ourselves, our relationships, and our choices with a lucidity that is rare and precious. Clarity allows us to act from insight rather than impulse, from understanding rather than fear. Clarity transforms perception. Where once we saw chaos and conflict, we begin to notice patterns, possibilities, and solutions. Where once we were reactive, we become responsive. Where once we were consumed by worry, we find calm discernment. This is the clarity that allows us to navigate life with balance, grace, and wisdom. Another profound reward is emotional resilience. Attachment often magnifies suffering because when we cling, even minor setbacks feel catastrophic. But with the practice of letting go, emotional turbulence softens. Life's inevitable disappointments no longer define our well-being. Loss, failure, or change may still hurt, but the pain is tempered by a grounded sense of inner stability. The heart that practices release is steady, adaptable, and capable of responding rather than reacting. This practice also deepens compassion and connection. By releasing judgment, resentment, and rigid expectations, we can relate to others with greater empathy. Relationships become less about possession and more about presence. We see others clearly, without the distortion of our projections, and engage with genuine care rather than neediness. In doing so, our interactions carry more depth, warmth, and authenticity. Freedom, clarity, emotional resilience, compassion. These are the long-term fruits of a life practiced in mindful release. They are subtle at first, accumulating gradually like sunlight warming the earth. Over time, they transform the very way we experience existence. Consider the wisdom of the Buddhist teachings. Liberation is not given by circumstances, nor by acquiring wealth, status, or recognition. It arises from letting go of desire, attachment, and the false notion of permanent ownership over impermanent things. This liberation is accessible in every moment, yet it grows with patience, awareness, and consistent practice. The journey to these rewards is not without challenge. We will stumble. Attachments may resurface. Old habits of clinging can return. But every act of release strengthens the mind and heart, building a cumulative resilience that shapes a life of clarity, freedom, and authentic presence. Stories from ordinary life mirror this truth. Parents letting go of control over grown children, workers releasing obsession over perfection, friends releasing the need to be understood or validated, all experience a subtle but profound lightness. With each act, the invisible weight of attachment diminishes and the rewards become tangible. Calm, focus, joy, and the deep satisfaction of living in harmony with reality. Ultimately, the long-term rewards of letting go are not abstract ideals, they are lived experiences. They manifest in the steadiness of the heart, the sharpness of perception, the warmth of compassion, and the freedom to move through life fully awake. They remind us that release is not loss, it is gain, the gain of a life that is lighter, clearer, and more fully alive. As we approach the final chapter, we will bring all these insights together. We will reflect on the journey, from the invisible weights we first carried to the profound freedom we cultivate through mindful release. Chapter 10 will be an invitation, a conclusion that leaves you inspired, empowered, and ready to step into a life where letting go becomes a daily, transformative practice. We have walked a long path together, exploring the invisible weight we carry, the nature of attachment, the wisdom of timing, the practice of meditation, and the transformative power of compassion and forgiveness. We have seen how everyday stories reveal the subtle art of release, and we have discovered the long-term rewards: freedom, clarity, resilience, and presence. Now, we arrive at the culmination of this journey, the point where all the threads weave together into a single truth. Letting go is not a single act, it is a way of life. It is a continuous practice, a gentle unfolding of awareness, courage, and compassion that shapes every thought, every choice, and every moment. Letting go is not about losing. It is about gaining space, space for clarity, space for peace, space for love. It is about freeing the mind from the tyranny of attachment, the heart from the chains of resentment, and the spirit from the illusion that control is the path to happiness. It is about living fully in the present, awake to the beauty, impermanence, and mystery of life. Think of a river once again. In Chapter 2, we saw attachment as holding onto a branch drifting downstream. Now, with all that we have explored, we understand the river differently. Release does not mean surrendering helplessly to the current. It means learning to navigate with grace, aligning ourselves with the flow of life and moving with wisdom rather than against it. It means knowing when to hold, when to let go, and when to simply float with presence and clarity. The journey of letting go is also deeply human. We stumble, we cling, we resist, and we fall. But each act of awareness, each conscious release teaches us. Each choice to let go strengthens the mind, soothes the heart, and illuminates the path ahead. There is no failure in the attempt, only learning, growth, and the gradual emergence of freedom. The rewards are profound. In letting go, we discover our true possessions are not external, they are within. The capacity for presence, the depth of compassion, the clarity of mind, and the resilience of the heart. We realize that peace and happiness are not found in holding tightly, but in releasing wisely. Stories from life, nature, and the teachings of the Buddha all point to the same conclusion. Attachment creates suffering. Release creates liberation. Letting go is not a passive resignation, but an active, conscious, courageous practice. It is the practice of freedom, the cultivation of wisdom, and the art of living fully awake. And so, the journey does not end here. Every breath, every thought, every interaction is an opportunity to practice letting go. Each moment presents a choice, to cling or to release, to resist or to embrace, to fear or to trust. With awareness, courage, and compassion, we choose release, not once but continually. As you move forward from this reflection, remember that letting go is not an abstract concept or a distant goal. It is a living practice. Start small, notice the invisible weights, release what no longer serves, and cultivate freedom in your heart. Each act, no matter how minor it may seem, contributes to a life of clarity, resilience, and profound joy. The journey of letting go is not easy, but it is beautiful. It is the path that transforms suffering into understanding, heaviness into lightness, and attachment into freedom. It is the journey from clinging to peace, from grasping to presence, from limitation to boundless possibility. So take a deep breath. Feel the weight you carry. Notice where attachment tugs at your mind and heart. And with awareness, courage, and compassion, begin to release. Step lightly, move freely, and allow the art of letting go to guide you into a life that is fuller, freer, and more awake than you ever imagined possible. The river flows, the branches drift, the leaves fall, and through it all the wise learn to let go, not because they must, but because in release they discover the fullness of life itself. As we step lightly into each moment, carrying the wisdom of release, remember, every act of letting go brings you closer to clarity, peace, and freedom. If this journey of letting go resonated with you, consider subscribing to Zen Buddhism Wisdom. By joining us, you'll explore more teachings, stories, and practices that guide the heart and mind toward insight, serenity, and presence. And if you feel inspired, leave a comment sharing what letting go means in your life, or share this video with someone who might benefit from a little more ease and understanding. Together, let's continue walking the path of mindfulness, wisdom, and gentle freedom, one breath, one moment, one choice at a time.